In the summer of 1969, a speech was written that was never read aloud. It was short, and it was devastating. It told the world that two men who had traveled to the moon in peace would now stay there forever. It had already been typed up and quietly set aside, ready for the President of the United States to read on live television the moment it became clear that Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were never coming home. That speech came far, far closer to being read than almost anyone alive today realizes. Because the story everyone thinks they know, the footprints, the flag, one small step, very nearly ended in catastrophe. In the final minutes of the descent, with the whole world watching, the first moon landing came within about 30 seconds of disaster. This is how it almost went wrong. It's July 1969. An estimated 600 million people, the largest audience in the history of the world up to that point, are watching, holding their breath. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin are inside the lunar module, a flimsy, foil-wrapped craft nicknamed Eagle, descending toward the surface. The third crew member, Michael Collins, orbits high above them, alone. No human has ever attempted this. And of the entire mission, the landing, is the single most dangerous part of all. And the craft they were trusting with their lives was astonishingly fragile. To shave off every possible ounce of weight, the lunar module's outer walls were, in places, barely thicker than a few layers of aluminum foil, thin enough that a dropped tool or a careless boot could have punched a hole clean through them. It stood on spindly, insect-like legs. It looked almost handmade, and it had been built for exactly one job in the history of the universe. The powered descent to the surface would last around 12 minutes. 12 continuous minutes in which almost anything going wrong could end the mission, and the lives on board with it. The trouble starts on the way down. The lander is dropping toward the surface, 500 feet up and closing fast, when suddenly the guidance computer flashes an alarm, a code almost nobody recognizes. Then another. The computer is being overloaded, asked to do more all at once than it can handle. And, to the crew, it looks like the machine flying them to the surface might be about to quit. On the ground in mission control, the decision falls to a room full of very young engineers, some of them still in their 20s. One of them recognizes the code. A young engineer, barely in his mid-20s, who by sheer diligence had made himself a handwritten list of every obscure alarm the computer could possibly throw, and what each one really meant. Because of that list, he knows in an instant what the panicking alarm actually signifies. The computer isn't dying. It's simply overwhelmed, dropping its least important tasks while still doing the one that truly matters, flying the ship. In a matter of seconds, with lives on the line, they make the call. Keep going. Land. But then Armstrong looks out the window and sees a problem no computer could fix. The autopilot is flying them straight toward a crater ringed with huge boulders, some as big as cars, a landing zone that would smash the fragile lander to pieces. So Armstrong does the one thing they had trained for, but desperately hoped they would never need. He takes over by hand. Flying manually, skimming low across the lunar surface, he pushes the lander onward, past the crater, past the boulders, hunting for anywhere flat enough and smooth enough to set down. And every single second he searches, he is burning fuel he does not have. That is the crisis that nearly ended everything. The lander carried only the thinnest margin of landing fuel, and Armstrong was eating straight through it, still hunting for a safe spot. In mission control, an engineer began calling out how much time was left before they would be forced to abort the whole landing. 60 seconds. Armstrong flew on, still searching. 30 seconds. 30 seconds of fuel. That was all that stood between the first humans at the moon and a failed aborted landing. And then, at last, dust kicked up and blown outward by the engine. A shadow. A gentle bump. A light on the panel. Contact. Neil Armstrong had set the Eagle down on the moon with, by some estimates, only around 25 seconds of fuel to spare. And then came the words the entire world had been waiting for. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Back on Earth, Mission Control had been holding its breath so hard that one controller radioed up to say they had a room full of people who had nearly turned blue, and were only now starting to breathe again. It had worked. But only just. Here's the part that makes it even more astonishing. The computer that guided Apollo 11 down to the moon, the one that overloaded and nearly forced an abort, was, by any modern standard, unbelievably primitive. The phone in your pocket right now is millions of times more powerful than it. They flew to another world and landed on it partly by hand, with less computing power than a modern musical greeting card. What truly got them down wasn't raw technology. It was human skill and human nerve. And while two men fought to land, the third was living through a completely different kind of ordeal. Michael Collins stayed behind, orbiting the moon alone in the command module, the crew's only ride home. Every time his orbit carried him around the far side of the moon, he lost all radio contact with Earth and with his crewmates, totally cut off, the only human being for thousands of miles in any direction, with no one to talk to and no way to help. Some have called him the loneliest human being who ever lived, and he carried a quiet, terrible knowledge with him. If the landing went wrong, or if his crewmates somehow couldn't climb back up to his orbit, he would have to fly home alone, the sole survivor of Apollo 11. Because getting down onto the moon was only half of the danger. Getting back off it was the other half. And here, the mission very nearly unraveled over something absurdly small. While moving around the cramped cabin in their bulky suits after the moonwalk, one of the astronauts accidentally snapped off a small switch on the wall, the circuit breaker that armed the engine they needed to lift off the moon. Without it, that engine might never fire. They were standing on the surface of another world with a broken ignition switch and no spare. In the end, the fix was almost comically simple. They pushed a felt-tipped pen into the little gap where the switch had been, forced the circuit closed, and it held. An ordinary pen may well have saved both their lives. And that ascent engine was the final gamble of all. To leave the moon, everything came down to a single rocket engine firing perfectly. An engine that had never once been tested by actually launching off the real lunar surface. If it failed, there was no backup. No second engine, no rescue of any kind. The two astronauts would simply be stranded on the moon, alive, until their air quietly ran out. This was the exact moment that speech had been written for. The one already typed and waiting back on Earth, ready to tell the world that Armstrong and Aldrin would never return. And then the engine fired. That speech was never read. The Eagle rose off the moon, caught back up with Collins, and all three men came home. We remember Apollo 11 as a clean, shining triumph. The footprints, the flag. One small step for mankind, and it was. But the landing itself was a knife's edge, a failing computer, a field of boulders, a landing flown by hand with seconds of fuel remaining, a third man utterly alone in the dark, a broken switch saved by a pen, and a single engine that simply had to work. The greatest achievement in the history of human exploration came within a handful of seconds, and a handful of tiny lucky breaks, of becoming its greatest tragedy instead. There was a eulogy already written for it, a funeral that, by the very narrowest of margins, the world never had to hold. And that is exactly what makes it worth remembering. Not because it was easy, but because it so very nearly wasn't. Because when everything that could go wrong began to go wrong, a small group of human beings, both in space and on the ground, held their nerve and pulled off the impossible anyway.